The rain that night didn't fall. It attacked, furious and relentless, hammering down on the cracked pavement as though the sky itself had grown impatient with the world below. It was the kind of storm that blurred the edges of everything, turning the streetlights into trembling halos and washing the city clean of all color until it was nothing but shades of gray and shadow. I remember thinking how lonely it felt, how the rain had a way of making even a crowded street feel empty. And maybe that's why I noticed him. Because he didn't move like anyone else. Didn't run for shelter or shield his head or curse the weather. He just stood there, half collapsed against a lamppost, drenched and silent, as if the storm had been sent for him alone. At first I thought he was drunk, or homeless, or both. New York has its fair share of broken men, and I'd trained myself not to look too long, not to care too deeply, because caring in this city is an invitation to drown. But there was something about him, something defiant in the way he held himself even as his body trembled, like a soldier refusing to kneel. I saw the blood before I saw his eyes, a dark smear running down his temple, disappearing beneath the collar of his soaked white shirt. It was enough to make my stomach twist, but instead of walking away, I found myself stepping closer, my umbrella tilted against the wind, my pulse a wild, uneven rhythm in my ears. "Hey!" I called out, my voice barely cutting through the roar of the rain. Are you okay?" He didn't answer. His head lifted slowly, like it weighed more than it should. And when our eyes met, the rest of the city disappeared. They were the coldest eyes I'd ever seen, gray, sharp, unreadable, and yet there was a strange kind of softness buried deep inside them, the kind that doesn't belong to ordinary men. I should have run. Everything in me knew that. But instead I stepped closer, closing the distance between us until the edge of my umbrella touched his shoulder. "You're bleeding," I said, because it was all I could think to say, my words trembling as much as my hands. "I've had worse," he replied, his voice low and rough, like gravel scraped across silk. It wasn't an answer. It was a warning dressed as indifference. But he swayed on his feet, his breath hitching, and in that moment he stopped being a threat and became something else, something fragile, human, wounded. I caught his arm without thinking, feeling the tension coil in his muscles, and I realized how close he was to collapsing. "My studio's just across the street," I said quickly. "You can dry off there, just let me help you." For a long moment he didn't move. The rain slid down his face like melted glass, washing away streaks of blood, but his eyes stayed locked on mine, as if he was trying to decide whether I was real or some illusion conjured by exhaustion. Finally, he nodded, barely perceptible, and I guided him across the slick street, half supporting his weight, my umbrella doing little to protect either of us from the downpour. Inside the studio, the warmth hit us like a sigh. The space smelled faintly of turpentine and lavender, the scent of paint, of late nights and unspoken dreams. Canvases lined the walls, half-finished pieces that stared back at us like ghosts of moments I hadn't decided how to end. I flicked on the light, its glow spilling softly across his face, and for the first time I really saw him. He wasn't just handsome. He was dangerous. The kind of beautiful that makes you uneasy, like staring at the edge of a cliff and wanting to jump. His jaw was sharp, his hair dark, and slicked back from the rain. And beneath the open collar of his shirt, I could see the edge of a tattoo curling over his collarbone, something black and intricate that hinted at violence and vows. He sat down heavily on the stool by the easel, water dripping from his clothes, his gaze sweeping over the paintings around him as if memorizing them, like a man cataloging every escape route. "Why did you help me?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now, but edged with something that wasn't gratitude. I shrugged, searching for an answer that didn't sound naive. You looked like you needed it." He gave a short, humorless laugh, the sound bitter enough to taste. "That's not usually a reason people use." "Maybe not," I said softly, handing him a towel from the small sink in the corner. "But I'm not most people." For a moment, he just stared at me, and I could feel it. The weight of that stare, the way it pressed into the quiet air between us. Then he took the towel, his fingers brushing mine, and it was ridiculous how such a small touch could feel electric. He cleaned the blood from his temple in silence, and I busied myself pretending not to watch, pretending that the sight of his bruised knuckles and the faint scar along his throat didn't make me wonder what kind of life he lived to earn them. "Do you have a name?" I asked after a while. He hesitated. "Vince," he said. And though the word sounded casual, I could feel the lie underneath it, thin, deliberate, almost tender in its falseness. "Vince," I repeated, tasting it. "I'm Lena." He nodded, eyes flicking toward the rain-spattered window. "You should be more careful, Lena. Not everyone you help deserves it." I smiled faintly, even though something in his tone made my skin prickle. "Maybe, but everyone deserves a chance." He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw it again, that flicker of something broken and beautiful behind the steel. For a heartbeat, the storm outside and the one inside him felt the same. When he finally stood to leave, I didn't stop him. He moved with a quiet strength, a man rebuilt from scars and secrets. And though I wanted to ask who he was running from, what he was hiding, I didn't. Some truths come with consequences, and I wasn't brave enough to ask for mine. He paused at the door, glancing back at me, and the faintest curve touched his lips. "Keep your doors locked tonight," he said softly. "You never know who might come looking." Before I could reply, he was gone, swallowed by the rain, the echo of his footsteps fading into the city's endless hum. I stood there for a long time, my heart caught somewhere between curiosity and fear, until I noticed what he'd left behind. My umbrella, folded neatly on the stool where he'd been sitting. And beside it, something else. A single black rose, the petals dark and perfect, beaded with drops of rain that shimmered under the light. It shouldn't have frightened me. It was just a flower after all. But as I stared at it, something cold moved beneath my skin. A quiet whisper that told me this wasn't kindness. It was a promise, or a warning. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my window made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to shift. And as thunder rolled across the city, I caught myself wondering not who he was, but who might be looking for him. Because the next morning, the news spoke of blood on the docks, a gunfight between rival families, and a name that made my heart stop cold. Vincent Moretti. And that's when I realized the man I'd given shelter to wasn't lost. He was being hunted. I didn't mean to look at the news that morning. I rarely do, because it's always the same. The city bleeding quietly while the rest of us sip our coffee and pretend not to taste the iron. But there it was, playing on the small television mounted above the counter of the cafe I always stop at. The kind of place where the barista knows my order and never asks about my life. I was halfway through stirring my coffee when the words, "Shootout near the East River docks," flashed across the screen, followed by an image of flashing sirens reflected in pools of rainwater, and a headline that made something inside me still completely. Vincent Moretti, alleged Mafia enforcer missing after violent clash. The cup trembled slightly in my hands, the sound of ceramic against ceramic louder than it should have been, and I remember how my first thought wasn't fear. It was disbelief. The name couldn't belong to the same man I'd seen slumped under that lamppost, couldn't belong to the man who'd smiled, faintly, when he told me to lock my doors. I told myself it had to be coincidence, that Vince could be anyone, but the lie tasted bitter. The image on the screen didn't show his face, only grainy footage of a man ducking into an alley, dark hair plastered to his head from the rain, blood on his sleeve. Still, my heart knew. It recognized the silhouette even when my mind begged not to. I left the cafe before my coffee cooled, my umbrella clutched tight in my hand, though the rain had already stopped. The streets smelled of damp asphalt and exhaust, and as I walked, I couldn't stop replaying that night. His voice, the weight in it, the way he'd said my name like it wasn't a name at all, but a warning wrapped in tenderness. There was a sharpness to every memory now, as if the edges had been honed overnight. And the more I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that it wasn't my problem, the more it did. Back at my studio, the air felt too still. The black rose still sat where I'd left it, its petals almost unnaturally preserved, as if it refused to wilt. And I couldn't decide whether that made it more beautiful or more terrifying. I should have thrown it out. I should have pretended none of it happened, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself sketching him. His face, his eyes, that impossible tension between danger and vulnerability. And before I knew it, there were half a dozen versions of him scattered across my canvas, each one darker than the last. That was when I noticed the car. A sleek black sedan parked across the street, tinted windows, engine off. It had been there when I came in, but I hadn't paid attention until now. It hadn't moved since. A pulse of unease rippled through me, subtle but insistent. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination painting monsters where there were none. But I'd lived in this city long enough to know when I was being watched, and something about the stillness of that car screamed patience, like whoever sat inside wasn't in a hurry to leave. I tried to focus on my work, on the sound of the rain gutter dripping outside, but every few minutes my eyes drifted back to the window. The car remained unmoving. By late afternoon, when the sky began bruising into dusk, my nerves felt stretched thin. At 7, there was a knock on the door. 3 sharp, deliberate taps. I froze. For a moment, I just stared at the door, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whoever stood outside could hear it. Then I did what any rational person would do. I reached for my phone, ready to call someone, though I wasn't sure who. But then a voice spoke, low and polite and almost too calm. "Miss Hart?" I didn't recognize it. The kind of voice that belonged to pressed suits and measured steps. "Yes?" I managed, my hand still hovering near the phone. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said through the door. "I'm with the NYPD. May I have a moment of your time?" Something in me hesitated. The police? That should have made me feel safe, but it didn't. His tone was wrong, too smooth, too rehearsed. Still, I opened the door, just enough to see him. He looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not a precinct. Mid-40s, expensive coat, eyes that smiled without warmth. He held up a badge so quickly I barely caught the name before it vanished back into his pocket. "We're conducting follow-ups," he said, his gaze drifting past me into the studio. "There was an incident last night near the docks. We believe someone matching your description may have encountered one. Of the individuals involved..." My throat went dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." He smiled faintly, as though he expected that answer. "Of course. It's just a formality. A few witnesses mentioned seeing a man injured, possibly seeking shelter nearby. Tall, dark hair, mid-30s. Ring any bells?" I shook my head too quickly. "No, sorry." He studied me for a moment longer, then gave a slow nod. "Well, if you do remember anything, Miss Hart, please call this number." He handed me a card, the kind printed on thick paper that doesn't bend easily. Then, just as he turned to leave, he added casually, "Be careful who you open your door to. Not everyone is who they claim to be." The words lingered long after the echo of his footsteps faded. I stood there, staring at the card in my hand. No department logo, no precinct address. Just a name and a number, and the faint scent of expensive cologne. That night I didn't paint. I sat by the window instead, watching the street below, half expecting the car to return. It didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were still on me, somewhere beyond the glass. The city outside felt heavier than usual, its hum lower, its shadows deeper. By midnight, exhaustion finally pulled me under, though it was a restless kind of sleep, the kind that doesn't heal. I dreamt of rain, of footsteps approaching, of a voice whispering my name. When I woke, the studio was dark, except for the faint shimmer of moonlight slicing through the blinds, and then I heard it. Soft, deliberate, coming from outside. Someone was walking past my window. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. Silence stretched thin and trembling. I told myself it could be anything. A stray cat, a neighbor. But when I looked toward the window, I saw it. The faintest shape of a man, standing just beyond the glass, motionless. For a long, paralyzed second, we just stared at each other through the darkness. Then he moved, slow and sure, and the dim light caught the side of his face. It was him. Vince. He looked different this time, colder, angrier, as if something inside him had snapped. His shirt was torn, streaked with what looked like dried blood. His eyes found mine, and even through the glass I felt the gravity of them, the warning, the need. I rushed to the door, unlocking it before I could think. He stumbled inside without a word, his breath ragged, his knuckles bruised again, and the smell of smoke and iron clung to him like a second skin. "Vince," I began, but he cut me off, grabbing my wrist, his grip firm, his voice a growl. "You shouldn't have opened the door," he said, eyes burning into mine. "They know about you now." My pulse stuttered. "Who does?" He looked toward the window, his jaw tight, and for the first time I saw real fear in him. Not for himself, but for me. "The men who came for me," he said quietly. "The ones I didn't kill." Outside, somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed, then another. He met my gaze, and I saw it then. The storm I'd only glimpsed before, the one that never ended. "It's too late, Lena," he whispered. "They're here." The sound of the car doors slamming outside didn't echo like something ordinary. It was heavier, deliberate, the kind of sound that carries intent, that knows it's being heard, that knows the fear it summons is part of its message. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought I could hear it over the soft hum of the city through the cracked window pane. And I stood there frozen, my breath lodged in my throat, while Vincent, moved to the wall beside the window with the ease of someone who had done this before, who had lived his entire life with danger waiting just beyond the glass. His movements were silent, sharp, controlled. And in the dim light from the street lamp outside, his face looked carved from something cold and unyielding. He pulled the curtain aside by a fraction, the muscle in his jaw tightening as he looked out. And in that single moment I saw the change in him. Gone was the exhausted stranger I had pitied in the rain. Gone was the quiet man who had bled in my studio and spoken softly as if afraid to break the air between us. What stood in his place was something else entirely. Something darker. Something shaped by violence and survival, and the kind of pain that doesn't fade with time. "How many?" he murmured, almost to himself, and I realized he wasn't asking me. I swallowed hard, my voice breaking the fragile silence. "What do you mean, how many? Who's out there?" He turned toward me then, and there was no softness in his eyes, no trace of the man I'd nursed back to health. "They found me," he said quietly, his voice like a blade drawn from its sheath. "And because you opened the door, they found you too." The words landed like stones sinking into water, slow and inevitable, spreading ripples of panic through me. "You're scaring me," I whispered, though what I really meant was, "I'm already terrified, and you just made it real." He crossed the room in 2 strides, close enough that I could smell the faint metallic scent of blood on his skin, could see the fine tremor in his hands that betrayed the calm he was trying to maintain. "You need to listen to me, Lena," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Do exactly as I say. Don't argue. Don't ask questions. Just trust me." Trust him. The man whose name I'd seen on a screen tied to murder and organized crime. The man who had walked into my life soaked in rain and mystery and danger. But even as every rational part of me screamed to run, something deeper, the same reckless compassion that had made me offer him shelter, kept me rooted. He glanced again toward the window, then grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the back door. "Move," he whispered. I followed, my body trembling, my thoughts spinning into chaos. Outside, I could hear the low growl of an engine idling, the crunch of boots on wet pavement, and it struck me with paralyzing clarity that this wasn't a nightmare. It was someone else's reality, and I had stepped into it without realizing the cost. We slipped through the back of the studio, into the narrow alley behind it. The air smelled of garbage and rain, thick and heavy, and the neon glow from a nearby sign painted everything in pale red and blue. Vincent pressed a hand to my back, guiding me forward, his other hand hidden beneath his jacket, and it took me a moment to realize he was holding a gun. "Jesus," I breathed. "What did you get me into?" He didn't look at me when he answered. "Something I never wanted you to see." We made it to the end of the alley before the headlights swept across the far corner, cutting through the fog like twin blades. He stopped abruptly, his arm shooting out to block me, and in the space of a heartbeat everything slowed. The doors of the car opening, the muffled voices calling his name, the metallic click that echoed like thunder in the narrow space. Then the first shot rang out. I didn't see where it came from. I only felt Vincent's hand grab me and pull me down, my knees scraping against the wet concrete as sparks flew from the brick wall beside us. The noise was deafening, the kind of sound that sears itself into your bones, and all I could do was cover my head and pray the world stopped exploding around me. Vincent fired back, 2 sharp bursts that lit the alley with flashes of white, and shouted something I couldn't hear over the chaos. My lungs burned, my heart refused to slow, and when the shooting finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. "Get up," he hissed, pulling me to my feet. "We have to move." We ran. I don't remember how far or how long, only that the city blurred around us, a labyrinth of lights and sirens and distant shouts. My breath came in ragged gasps, my shoes slipping on the wet pavement, but I kept going because he didn't let go of my hand, because every time I faltered, his grip tightened as if he could anchor me to life through sheer will. We ducked into another alley, this one narrower, darker, and he stopped suddenly, pressing his back against the wall. I leaned beside him, trembling so hard I could barely stand, trying to make sense of the chaos. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. "What the hell is happening?" He turned toward me, his face half-shadowed, his breathing heavy. "I told you my name," he said. "You just didn't know what it meant." He wiped blood from his cheek with the back of his hand, his jaw clenched tight. "The men you saw, they work for a rival family, the Rossies. They've been hunting me since the docks." I stared at him, words tumbling uselessly in my mind. "You're saying—" "I'm saying," he cut in, "you should have let me die in the rain." The way he said it wasn't cruel. It was hollow, like he'd already accepted it as truth. I wanted to be angry, to scream that none of this was my fault, that he had dragged me into something monstrous. But the look in his eyes stopped me. There was regret there, real and raw, the kind that only comes from a man who knows he's destroyed too many things to count. A siren wailed in the distance, closer this time. Vincent pushed off the wall, his gaze scanning the street. "They'll keep coming. The Rossies don't stop until the body's cold." "And me?" I asked quietly. He looked at me for a long time, as though deciding whether to tell me the truth. "They'll come for you too," he said finally. "They'll think you know something, that you're my weakness." I let out a shaky breath, the world tilting slightly beneath me. "And are you?" Something flickered in his expression. Pain, maybe, or something dangerously close to tenderness. "You shouldn't be," he whispered, "but yes." Before I could respond, he turned sharply toward the sound of approaching footsteps. The echo bounced off the narrow walls, growing louder. Vincent pulled me back, deeper into the shadows, his body pressed against mine, shielding me. I could feel the rapid thud of his heart, could feel the heat of his breath against my ear as he whispered, "Stay quiet." The footsteps passed, slow and measured, pausing just beyond the alley mouth. A flashlight beam swept the street, hovering for a heartbeat too long before moving on. Only when the sound finally faded did Vincent exhale, the tension in his body loosening slightly. He looked at me then, and for the first time since that night in the rain, I saw something in him that wasn't rage or control. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying too many ghosts. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he said, his voice softer now, though the edge never fully disappeared. "But once we get there, you don't ask questions. You don't tell anyone your name. You don't go back to your old life, understand?" I nodded. Because what else could I do? As we stepped back into the street, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of rain on concrete, sharp and clean. The city stretched before us, indifferent, immense, uncaring, and for the first time in my life I realized how easy it is to disappear here, how simple it is to lose yourself to someone else's war. Vincent looked over his shoulder once more, scanning the darkness, his hand tightening around mine. "You shouldn't have helped me," he murmured, almost to himself. "But now it's too late." And as the distant rumble of thunder rolled across the skyline, I finally understood what he meant. Because whatever storm he'd been running from wasn't over. It had just found me too. I used to believe that names were just labels, delicate syllables we wore like loose clothing, meant to be changed, forgotten, or outgrown as time reshaped us. But when I heard his name, Vincent Moretti, spoken not through rumor or whisper, but from his own lips in the dark safety of that abandoned apartment where he'd hidden us, I understood that names could also be cages, built not from iron or law, but from the weight of everything they carried. His name wasn't just a word, it was a kingdom carved from blood and silence, and by saving him, I had walked right into its walls. The apartment was small, tucked above an old tailor's shop that smelled faintly of dust and fading fabric. The wallpaper peeled in thin strips, the radiator rattled like a restless ghost, and yet it was the first time in hours that I could hear my own breathing without fear of it being my last. Vincent moved through the shadows like a man who belonged to them, every motion purposeful, every glance sharp. Checking locks, peering through blinds, scanning exits. There was an unspoken ritual in the way he prepared for danger, as though he'd done it so many times he no longer questioned why. When he finally turned toward me, the room felt smaller, his presence filling the air like static before lightning. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, streaked with dirt and dried blood, and though he carried himself with the same rigid control, I could see the exhaustion in the small tremor of his hands. "You should eat," he said, voice low, his tone almost gentle but still carrying that distant edge, as if kindness were something foreign to his mouth. I sat on the edge of the old couch, the springs groaning beneath me, and stared at him as he opened a can of soup from a small stash he'd found in the kitchen. "You still haven't told me why they're after you," I said softly. "You said their name, the Rossies, but what does that mean? Who are you really?" He hesitated, the can opener pausing mid-turn, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he sighed, a sound that came from somewhere deep and tired, and he leaned back against the counter. "My name," he began slowly. Doesn't belong to me. It was born before I was, written in ledgers filled with blood and promises. The Morettis are one of the 5 families that built this city's underworld. My father was the boss before me. He taught me that loyalty mattered more than truth, that power was the only kind of faith men understood. He looked at me then, his eyes catching the dim light, and for the first time I saw the boy he must have once been, the one who had learned cruelty before compassion. When he died, Vincent continued, I took what was his. The money, the men, the enemies. And now the Rossis want to take it back. They want everything I have, and everyone who ever stood near me. The words hung between us, heavy and slow, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. So when you came to me that night? He nodded. I'd been ambushed. The docks. I barely got away. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. I wanted to believe that, wanted to hold on to the illusion that my kindness had been something pure and unconnected to this world he carried like a curse. But the truth was more complicated, tangled in something invisible but binding, something that had already started to wrap around my heart. He slid the opened can toward me, but I couldn't bring myself to eat. My stomach twisted with too many questions. You killed people tonight, I said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, it was a confession of realization, the acknowledgement of the darkness I'd already glimpsed in his eyes. His expression didn't change, but his silence said everything. I didn't want you to see that part, he said finally, his voice softer, regret bleeding through the steel. But there's no going back now. You've seen what I am. What are you? I whispered. He took a slow breath, his jaw tightening. A man who was supposed to die a long time ago. A man who keeps surviving because he doesn't know how to stop. I didn't answer. The city hummed faintly outside, the sound of tires on wet asphalt, distant horns, and the occasional burst of laughter that reminded me that somewhere beyond these walls, people were still living ordinary lives untouched by violence. I envied them, and yet, sitting here with him, I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. He sank into the armchair opposite me, his eyes half closed, his hand resting near the gun on the table. The sight of it, casual, expected, felt surreal. It wasn't fear I felt anymore. It was something else, something dangerous in its own right. Fascination. There was a rhythm to him, a kind of gravity that drew me closer even when I knew better. I should go to the police, I said suddenly, though the words felt weak the moment they left my mouth. Vincent's eyes snapped open, his gaze locking onto mine. And tell them what? That you helped a murderer? That you sheltered a man with half the city's blood on his hands? They'd make you disappear before you even finished your sentence. The silence that followed was thick, alive with the sound of everything we weren't saying. Finally he stood, walked toward the window, and peered through the blinds again. The movement was restless, haunted. They'll find us soon, he murmured. They always do. Then what happens? He looked back at me, and in that look was the kind of honesty that hurts to receive. Then I make sure you don't get hurt because of me. There was no heroism in his tone, no promise of redemption, just weary certainty, the kind that comes from living too long inside your own mistakes. And for reasons I couldn't explain, that honesty was more terrifying than any lie could have been. He came closer then, so close I could feel the heat of him, the quiet thunder of his breath. You should hate me, he said, almost a whisper. You probably do. I don't, I said before I could stop myself, the truth spilling out, fragile and wrong and real. His expression shifted, surprise first, then something darker, something like pain wrapped in longing. You don't know what you're saying, Lena. Maybe not, I murmured, but I know what I feel. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. The air between us was heavy, charged, trembling on the edge of something neither of us dared to name. Then he stepped back abruptly, as if distance could undo the gravity that had already formed between us. "Go to sleep," he said, his voice rougher now. "You'll need your strength." I didn't argue. I lay down on the couch, my eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling, listening to the faint creak of floorboards as he paced near the window. Outside, the rain began again. Softer this time, almost like a lullaby. But I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about his name, Moretti, and how easily it had slipped from his mouth, as if he were tired of hiding it, tired of pretending to be someone else. And as the hours bled into dawn, I realized that what terrified me most wasn't who he was. It was who I was becoming because of him. When I finally drifted into restless sleep, I dreamt of the night we met. The rain, the blood, the umbrella. And when I woke, sunlight was creeping through the blinds. The chair where he had been sitting was empty. The door was open. And on the table where the gun had been, there was only a note written in hurried scrawl. "Stay inside. Don't answer the door. Trust no one." Beneath it, a single black rose. And somewhere outside, in the waking city, the devil's name was being whispered again. This time, with mine attached to it. Morning came slowly, crawling through the blinds like a secret afraid to reveal itself. And for a long time I lay there on that old couch, staring at the empty space where Vincent had sat. The note still trembling in my hands as if it had been written only moments ago, as if his presence still lingered in the air, in the faint scent of smoke and gunpowder and something distinctly him, a mixture of danger and warmth that should have been incompatible, yet somehow wasn't. The city outside was just beginning to stir, the hum of tires on wet asphalt and distant horns weaving into the rhythm of morning life. And I remember thinking how strange it felt to know that somewhere out there people were drinking coffee, checking their phones, walking their dogs, completely unaware that the world could tilt so easily into darkness with just one name, one choice, one wrong act of kindness. I told myself I wouldn't wait for him, that I would take his warning seriously, lock the door, stay put, and do the sensible thing. But waiting became its own kind of paralysis, and as the hours dragged by, my thoughts turned restless, looping endlessly between fear and curiosity, guilt and longing. His note lay beside the rose on the table, the ink slightly smudged where my thumb had brushed it, and every time I looked at it I heard his voice again, low, rough, commanding, threaded with that impossible combination of protectiveness and despair. At noon, the silence became unbearable. I paced the apartment, checked the window, made coffee I didn't drink, and tried to convince myself that his absence meant safety. But safety, I was beginning to understand, was an illusion you lost the moment you looked into Vincent Moretti's eyes and didn't turn away. It was evening when he returned. The sound of the door unlocking jolted me upright, my heart racing before my mind even caught up. He stepped inside without a word, his clothes damp, his hair tousled, a shadow of exhaustion carved deep beneath his eyes. There was blood on his sleeve again, darker this time, dried and cracked like old paint, and something colder in his expression, as though part of him had stayed behind wherever he'd been. "You're hurt," I said before I could stop myself, my voice trembling with something that wasn't quite fear. "It's not mine," he replied, his tone flat, final, as if that were supposed to reassure me. He closed the door and turned the lock, the click echoing too loudly in the small space. For a long moment we just stared at each other, the silence between us charged with everything we hadn't said. Then he exhaled slowly, his hand dragging through his hair. "I told you to stay inside," he said quietly. "I did," I answered. "You left me here without any idea what's happening. What was I supposed to do? Pretend this isn't real?" His eyes softened for a fraction of a second, and then the steel returned. Pretending is how people survive, Lena. It's the only thing that keeps them breathing. He walked past me into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter like he was trying to hold himself together. I could see the weight in his shoulders, the heaviness that came from more than just exhaustion. It was the kind of weariness that comes from carrying too many lives, too many deaths. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at me when he answered. "I made sure they can't find us tonight." Something about the way he said "made sure" made my stomach tighten. I wanted to ask what that meant, but part of me already knew. Instead, I said, "You can't keep living like this, Vincent. You can't keep killing people and expecting the world not to notice." He turned to me then, slowly, his gaze sharp enough to cut through every illusion I'd tried to build. "You think I like this?" he said, his voice low but shaking with restrained fury. "You think I wanted this life? You think I haven't tried to end it?" He took a step closer, and I could feel the heat of his anger, the anguish beneath it. "Every man in my family was born into this, Lena. My father's sins, my brother's death, my own blood, it's all tied together. You can't walk away from something that's written into your bones." His words hit me harder than I expected. I thought of the way he'd looked that night in the rain, lost, wounded, human, and how different he was now, every edge sharpened by survival. "Then what are you still fighting for?" I asked quietly. For a moment, he didn't answer. He looked down at his hands, flexing them slowly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost broken. "Because you gave me something I haven't had in years," he said. "You looked at me like I wasn't a monster. You saw the man, not the name." The air between us shifted then, thick with something raw and dangerous. I felt it in my chest, in the way my heartbeat tangled with his words. "Vincent," I started, but he was already moving closer. He stopped just in front of me, close enough that I could see the faint bruise at his jaw, the ghost of a scar beneath his collar. His eyes caught mine, and for a heartbeat the world shrank to nothing but the space between us. "You shouldn't have helped me," he whispered. "You should have walked away that night." "Maybe," I said, my voice barely audible. "But I didn't." Something inside him cracked then, not loud or visible, but deep. He reached up, his hand brushing against my cheek, and the touch was so gentle it almost undid me. "I can't promise you safety," he said, his words trembling with restraint. "But I can promise you this. Anyone who tries to hurt you will never breathe again." The intensity in his tone frightened me. But beneath the terror was something else. Something magnetic and consuming. The quiet understanding that this was no longer about survival. It was about possession. He stepped back slightly, reaching into his jacket, and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "This," he said, laying it on the table, "is a new identity, a new name. If things go wrong, if I don't come back, you use it. You disappear." I stared at it, my pulse loud in my ears. "Why are you doing this?" "Because they won't stop," he said simply. "Because you're already in it now, and because—" He hesitated, as if the words cost him something. "Because I don't want to lose you." My throat tightened, and before I could find words, he took my hand, turning it palm up. His thumb traced along my wrist, over the faint beat of my pulse, as though he were memorizing it. "You saved my life," he said softly. "Let me save yours." It wasn't a question, but a vow, dark, desperate, final. When he leaned closer, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air smelled of rain and blood and inevitability, and when his lips brushed mine, it wasn't soft or hesitant. It was an ache, a confession, a surrender wrapped in fury. For a fleeting second, I forgot everything. The gun on the table, the shadows outside, the truth of his name. and remembered only that this man, for all his violence, kissed me like someone who'd never been forgiven. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against mine. His voice a whisper meant only for me. From now on, what happens to me happens to you. That's the price. I wanted to tell him I didn't understand, that I couldn't live in this world of his, but the words dissolved on my tongue, because even though I knew this was wrong, part of me had already accepted it. Outside, thunder rolled again, soft but promising. Vincent straightened, the resolve returning to his eyes. "They'll come again," he said, "and when they do, you stay behind me." He picked up the gun, slid it into his holster, and for a brief, haunting moment, I saw something almost tender flicker across his face before it vanished. I looked at the paper on the table, the new name, the new life, and I knew that somewhere, somehow, a part of the old me had already died. He reached for the door, pausing just long enough to look back at me. "You gave me shelter once, Lena," he said softly. "Now I'll burn the world to shelter you." And before I could stop him, before I could ask him to stay, he was gone again, swallowed by the night that had claimed him long before I ever held out an umbrella in the rain. But this time, I didn't wait for him to come back out of fear. I waited because I already knew, whether he returned alive or not, I was no longer outside his world. I was bound to it, by blood, by choice, by love. I didn't sleep that night, not because I wasn't tired, but because sleep felt like surrender, and I couldn't afford to close my eyes knowing that somewhere out there, Vincent was walking into the fire again. The same fire that had shaped him, burned him, defined him, and somehow refused to kill him. The apartment felt emptier than it had before he came back, though his presence lingered in everything. The faint trace of his cologne on my skin, the half-drunk glass of water on the counter, the folded paper with my new name still lying on the table, like an unspoken sentence. Every sound outside made my heart leap, the whisper of tires on wet asphalt, the low wail of a siren, the click of a door somewhere down the hall. And each time, I thought it might be him returning, or worse, someone coming to finish what he'd started. The hours stretched endlessly, time blurring until dawn began to seep through the blinds, washing the room in that pale, uncertain light that makes everything feel like a memory. I sat there wrapped in a blanket, holding his note again, reading and rereading the lines as if the ink could somehow steady me. Stay inside. Don't answer the door. Trust no one. It sounded less like a warning now and more like a prophecy, and I began to understand that trust, once you stepped into his world, wasn't just fragile. It was extinct. When the door finally opened just after sunrise, I didn't run to him, didn't speak at first, because there was something sacred about the moment he stepped back into the room, like watching a ghost materialize. He looked different again. The exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. His knuckles split, his shirt stained. But his eyes were alive in that dangerous, magnetic way that made me forget the rest of the world existed. "You're still here," he said quietly, as though the thought of me leaving had been both expected and feared. I wanted to tell him I didn't know where else to go, that every path outside this one felt like walking into someone else's lie. But instead I just nodded. "You said not to leave." A faint smile ghosted across his lips, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes but still softens the edges of the face. "Good, I didn't think you would." He crossed the room, dropped his gun onto the table, and sank into the chair across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick and heavy, like rain-soaked air before a storm. When he finally broke it, his voice was rough, frayed by fatigue. "They tried to hit one of our warehouses last night," he said, staring at the table as he spoke. "Rossi's men. They thought they could take it while I was gone. Did you? I started, then stopped, unsure if I wanted to hear the rest. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine with that piercing clarity that always left me breathless. Yes, he said simply. I made sure they won't try again. I should have been horrified, and maybe I was, somewhere deep beneath the numbness that had settled into me. But there was something else too. An ache. A strange, painful tenderness at the thought of him doing these things not just out of vengeance, but out of the twisted logic of survival, of protecting something fragile in a world built entirely of ruin. You don't have to tell me, I said softly. You don't owe me explanations. He shook his head, leaning back, his gaze tracing the cracks in the ceiling. You think this is about owing? You should know what you're part of now. You should know what it means to stand next to me. I already do, I said, though I wasn't sure if I was convincing him or myself. I know it's dangerous. I know people will come for you. For us. For you, he corrected, his tone sharpened by fear he didn't want to admit. They'll use you to get to me. That's how this works. You're not a bystander anymore, Lena. You're leverage. The word cut deep, cold and cruel, because it was true. I looked away, trying to steady my breath, and for a long time, the only sound was the low creak of the radiator and the faint murmur of the city waking below. Then out of nowhere, he spoke again, quieter this time, almost as if he were talking to himself. I never wanted this life, he said, but once you take power, it doesn't let you go. Every move you make, every choice, it owns you. You think you can control it, but it's already in your blood. He glanced at me then, and there was something raw in his eyes, a vulnerability so fleeting it almost hurt to see. You shouldn't have seen what I am, he murmured. I didn't want you to. I don't care, I said, and it came out sharper than I intended, because it wasn't a lie. I didn't care anymore. I don't care what you've done. I care about who you are when you're here, when you're with me. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no joy in it, only disbelief. You don't know what that means, Lena. Loving someone like me, it's like trying to hold lightning. It'll burn you even if it lights your way. I met his gaze and held it, feeling something inside me twist and solidify into something terrifyingly certain. Then let it burn. He stared at me for a long time, his jaw tightening. And then he stood abruptly, pacing toward the window as if he couldn't stand to be near me and yet couldn't bear to leave. The light from the morning sun caught the curve of his face, highlighting the faint scar along his neck, the shadows beneath his eyes. When he finally turned back, something in him had shifted, a decision, heavy and irreversible. If you're going to stay, he said, you need to understand what that means. My life doesn't have room for halfway. You're either in it or you're out. And if you're in, there's no going back. I rose slowly, the air thick between us. Then I'm in, I said. He looked at me for what felt like forever, as if testing whether I meant it, whether I understood. Then wordlessly he crossed the space between us and took my face in his hands, his touch trembling. God help you, he whispered, and then his mouth was on mine. The kiss wasn't tender. It was desperate, consuming, full of everything we couldn't say. I could taste the exhaustion, the fear, the violence that clung to him like a second skin, and still, I wanted more. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and the world tilted. For a moment, I wasn't afraid. For a moment, it was just us, the sinner and the fool who chose him. When he finally pulled away, his forehead rested against mine, his breath uneven. You don't know what you've done, he said softly, but I'll protect you, even if it kills me. The words shouldn't have comforted me, but they did. Later, when he fell asleep in the armchair, his gun resting loosely in his hand. I watched him through the fading light. There was something almost peaceful about him then, stripped of his armor, his jaw unclenched, his chest rising and falling steadily. And I realized, with quiet horror, that I was no longer looking at him as a stranger who had invaded my life, but as someone I couldn't imagine living without. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, echoing across the skyline. The storm was coming again, the same storm that had brought him to me, that had taken everything I'd once been sure of. And I knew deep down that there would be no escaping it this time. Because the truth was, the storm wasn't outside anymore. It was here, between us, inside us, alive and raging and beautiful. And I didn't want it to stop. The night it happened, the air was thick with heat and silence, the kind of silence that doesn't belong to peace but to waiting, to the slow, invisible tightening of something inevitable. Vincent had left an hour before, his last words still echoing in the hollow space he left behind. Lock the door. Don't answer for anyone. I'll be back before sunrise. I had promised I would, had even stood by the door after he left, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading down the stairwell until they were swallowed by the city. And yet, despite every warning, despite every instinct that told me to be still, I found myself pacing, restless, the air pressing too heavily on my chest, every tick of the clock slicing through the quiet like a blade. The storm outside hadn't yet broken, but it was coming. The clouds swollen and dark, the wind carrying that low hum of electricity that makes your skin feel alive and terrified all at once. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see him walking up the street, coat collar turned up, eyes shadowed, that look of quiet defiance painted across his face. But the street was empty. The city felt emptied of him. I don't know what made me open the door that night. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the ache of waiting, or the quiet, desperate need to prove that I wasn't just a bystander in his world. I told myself I would only step outside for a minute, only to breathe air that didn't taste like fear. But the moment the door closed behind me, I knew I'd made a mistake. The street was too still. The world too quiet. Then I heard it. The soft scrape of a shoe against wet pavement. Before I could turn, a hand shot out from the darkness, pressing something cold and metallic against my neck. A voice whispered, low and calm, almost kind. "Don't scream, sweetheart. We're not here to hurt you unless you make us." The next few moments blurred together, swallowed by panic. Rough hands grabbed my wrists, a sharp sting bit into my arm, and the world tilted sideways. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the flash of a silver ring engraved with a serpent wrapped around a crown, the emblem of the Rossi family. When I woke, the first thing I felt was cold. It seeped through the concrete beneath me, through the air, through my skin. The room was dark except for a single bare bulb swinging from the ceiling, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. My wrists were bound, my mouth dry, and the metallic taste of fear lingered like rust on my tongue. I wasn't alone. 2 men stood near the door. One tall and broad-shouldered with a face carved from stone, the other slimmer, wearing a smirk that told me he enjoyed the sight of fear. But it was the man sitting across from me that froze my blood. He was older, his hair streaked with silver, his suit immaculate despite the grime of the place. His posture was effortless, almost regal, the kind of stillness that comes only from absolute control. He regarded me with calm, assessing eyes, the eyes of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to make the room obey. "Miss Hart," he said smoothly, his accent faint but distinct, Italian polished to perfection. "You've caused us quite a bit of trouble." My throat ached when I spoke. "I don't know who you are." He smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. Oh, I think you do. You may not know my name, but you know my shadow. I am Alessandro Rossi, and you, my dear, have found yourself standing in the middle of a war that was never yours to fight. I tried to steady my voice. I don't know anything about your war. I didn't do anything. That's the beauty of it, he said softly, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. You don't have to do anything. You just have to exist in his orbit. That's enough. Vincent, I breathed, his name escaping before I could stop it. Ah, Rossi said, his smile widening slightly. So you do know who he is, the great Vincent Moretti, the prodigal son of a dying dynasty. He stood then, walking slowly around me, his footsteps measured. Do you know how many men he's killed in my family's name? How many brothers, cousins, loyal soldiers? And yet somehow, none of them hurt him as deeply as you could. My stomach turned. He'll come for me. I'm counting on it, Rossi said simply. You see, Vincent is a man who doesn't fear death. He's made peace with it a long time ago. But losing something he loves, that's a different kind of hell. That's the cage he can't break. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, that Vincent wasn't capable of love. Not really, not with all the ruin inside him. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever existed between us had already crossed that fragile line between survival and surrender. Rossi crouched beside me, his cologne sharp and clean. You can make this easier for yourself, Lena. Tell me where he is. Tell me where he hides his shipments, his men, his secrets, and I will make sure you live. Refuse, and... His fingers brushed my jaw, almost gently. You'll wish you had. I met his gaze, forcing myself not to flinch. You think I'd betray him? His expression softened, almost pitying. I think you're not as strong as you believe. But I was. Or maybe I was just stubborn enough to pretend. I stayed silent. I kept my eyes on the floor, on the faint crack running through the concrete, and waited for whatever came next. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. The men talked quietly among themselves, their words a blur. The bulb overhead flickered, and then the door burst open. Chaos erupted like a gunshot. 2 of Rossi's men fell before they could react, the sharp rhythm of suppressed gunfire cutting through the air. The remaining guard spun, firing wildly, but he was dead before the second bullet left his gun. And then he was there, Vincent, emerging from the shadows like something the dark itself had created. His clothes were black, his eyes burning with a fury so absolute it silenced the room. He didn't speak. He just moved, fast, precise, unstoppable. When it was over, only Rossi remained standing, his calm finally cracking as he stepped back toward the wall. Moretti, Rossi hissed, his composure slipping. You don't walk away from this. Vincent raised his gun, his voice low, deadly calm. Neither do you. The shot echoed like thunder, final and merciless. Rossi fell, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the violence that had preceded it. Then Vincent turned to me. His face was pale, streaked with blood that wasn't his. His eyes wild and searching until they found mine. He crossed the room in 3 strides, cutting the ties from my wrists, his hands shaking. Did they hurt you? He asked, his voice breaking in a way I'd never heard before. I shook my head. But tears I hadn't realized I'd been holding back spilled over anyway. He caught my face in his hands, his touch trembling but careful, as if afraid I'd disappear. I told you to stay inside, he whispered, the anger gone, replaced by something worse, fear. You don't understand what I'd do if I lost you. I wanted to tell him I understood now, that I finally knew what kind of man he was, not the monster the world painted him as, but something more tragic, more terrifying, a man willing to destroy everything for love. He pulled me against him, his arms wrapping around me so tightly I could feel his heartbeat hammering against my chest, fierce and frantic. "It's over," he said. But even as he spoke, we both knew it wasn't. Because men like Vincent Moretti don't get peace. They only buy time. And as the first rumble of thunder rolled outside, as the storm finally broke against the city, I realized the cage wasn't the room we'd escaped. It was the love that had built itself around us. Beautiful and suffocating. He was my savior and my captor both, and I was already wearing his crown of ruin. There are moments in life that split you open, that tear through whatever fragile illusion of control you thought you had. And what's left behind isn't the person you were, but something new. Something half-born from grief and half-forged from survival. That night, after the warehouse burned and Rossi's blood mingled with the rain, I realized I was no longer the woman who'd once given a stranger an umbrella in the storm. I was something else entirely now. Someone reshaped by fire, by fear, by love that had become indistinguishable from ruin. The city looked different through the shattered windows of the safe house Vincent took me to. A narrow, forgotten building on the outskirts of Brooklyn, where the streetlights flickered like dying memories. The air smelled of wet metal and smoke. And though he told me we were safe for now, the word safe had lost its meaning somewhere between his gunfire and my trembling hands. He moved through the dim room in silence, pacing, scanning, listening for sounds only he could hear. I watched him from the corner of the torn sofa, my fingers still stained with Rossi's blood, unable to stop shaking. He hadn't said much since the escape, just fragments, sharp and precise. "We have to move. They'll retaliate. Don't look back." His voice had carried no emotion then, just command, and I'd followed like something under a spell, my body reacting before my mind could. Now, with the adrenaline drained, reality settled over me like ash, heavy and suffocating. I finally spoke, my voice raw and unsteady. "You killed him?" Vincent stopped, his back to me, shoulders tense. "I had to." "There's always a reason, isn't there?" I whispered. "There's always a reason to kill, a reason to destroy, a reason to stay in the fire instead of walking out." He turned slowly, and when he looked at me, the fury that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something hollow, something that frightened me more than his rage ever could. "You think I wanted this?" he asked, his voice low, frayed at the edges. "You think I don't wake up every day wishing someone else had pulled the trigger instead of me?" I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe that the man who had held me so gently in the dark wasn't the same one who'd painted the night in blood. But belief had become a fragile thing in his world, a luxury neither of us could afford. He came closer then, kneeling in front of me, his hands hovering near mine but not touching. "I did what I had to do to keep you alive," he said quietly. "I'd do it again." I closed my eyes, a tear slipping free before I could stop it. That's what terrifies me. His silence stretched, and for a moment the only sound was the steady rhythm of the rain outside. Then he reached up, his thumb brushing the tear away, his touch feather light. "You don't have to understand it," he murmured. "You just have to let me protect you." I almost laughed then, a bitter, broken sound that didn't feel like my own. "Protect me from what, Vincent? From them? From yourself? Or from the world you keep dragging me into?" He flinched, barely, but I saw it, the small fracture in his control. "You think I wanted you in this?" he said, his tone roughening. "You think I didn't try to stay away after that night in the rain? But you wouldn't let me go." "I tried to save you," I said, my voice rising, trembling. "That's what people do. When they see someone bleeding on the street, they try to save them." He met my gaze and his eyes burned, not with anger, but with a kind of grief so deep it made me want to look away. "You didn't save me, Lena," he said quietly. "You chose me. And now we both have to live with that." The words sank into me like a slow knife. Cruel not because they were untrue, but because they were. He stood then, pacing toward the window, the dim glow from outside tracing the sharp lines of his face. "The Rossies will come again," he said. "Their men are like roaches. You crush one nest, another crawls out of the dark. But they won't find you here. I've made sure of it." I rose from the sofa, the blanket falling from my shoulders. "And what about you?" I asked softly. "Where do you go when there's no one left to fight?" He didn't answer right away, just stared out at the rain. "There's always someone left to fight," he said finally. "That's the curse." The silence that followed was unbearable. I wanted to go to him, to close the distance, to erase the blood between us, but I didn't move. Because part of me understood that love, at least the kind we shared, didn't heal, it consumed. When he finally turned around, his expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "You need to rest," he said. "I'll keep watch." "I can't," I whispered. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him." Vincent's jaw tightened. "Then look at me instead." I did. I looked at him. Really looked. At the bruises forming along his collarbone, the cuts at his knuckles, the faint tremor in his hands. The man who stood before me wasn't invincible. He was breaking in quiet ways, held together only by the violence that kept him alive, and the love that was slowly killing us both. He stepped closer, his voice gentler now. "Come here." And I did. He pulled me into his arms, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. I felt his heartbeat against my chest, fierce and desperate, like something fighting to remind itself it was still human. The rain battered the windows harder now, the storm finally breaking, and it felt almost poetic that the sky should weep when we couldn't. "I don't know how to be with you," I whispered against his chest. "Not when everything around us is falling apart." His hand tangled in my hair, his breath warm against my ear. "Then don't try to be anything," he murmured. "Just be here. With me. Right now." So I did. I stopped thinking. I stopped questioning. I let myself fall into the moment, into him, because for all the blood and chaos that surrounded him, there was something sacred in the way he held me. Something that made the world make sense for just a heartbeat. Later, when we lay tangled together on the cold floor, his arm draped over me protectively, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain. The storm had settled into a steady rhythm now, a lullaby of chaos and calm, and I thought of the first night we met, of the umbrella between us, of how innocence had felt before it drowned. Vincent stirred beside me, half asleep, his voice a whisper. "If I die," he said, "promise me you'll run. Promise me you'll forget my name." I turned to face him, tracing the scar along his throat with my fingertip. "Don't ask me to do that," I said softly. "You're in me now. I couldn't forget you even if I wanted to." He smiled faintly, that rare, fleeting smile that broke my heart each time I saw it. "That's the problem, Lena. You never learn when to let go." Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the room for the briefest moment, casting his face in sharp, ethereal light. And in that instant, I realized he was right. I didn't know how to let go. Not of him. Not of the danger. Not of the storm that had somehow become my home. When the thunder rolled again, I whispered into the darkness, "Then let it take us both." He didn't answer. He just pulled me closer, his breath warm against my neck. And I knew he was already halfway gone, his mind drifting back to the world that owned him, the empire of ghosts and blood that would never release him. And I, foolish and lost, clung to him anyway. Because love, once broken and remade in the image of ruin, doesn't die. It only waits for the next storm, the next gunshot, the next goodbye. And I could already feel it coming. The days after the storm bled into one another. An endless loop of waiting, watching, and pretending that the silence meant safety, when deep down, we both knew it only meant we were living on borrowed time. The air inside the safe house was heavy with things unsaid. His fear disguised as vigilance, my guilt dressed up as gratitude. And every night when he left, I told myself he'd come back because he always did, and because the alternative was too unbearable to imagine. But something had changed in him after Rossi's death. Something deeper than exhaustion. His movements had become sharper, more deliberate. His voice quieter, as if every word he spoke now cost him more than it used to, as though he'd already started preparing for a goodbye he hadn't yet told me about. I could feel it in the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. The soft, almost reverent gaze of a man memorizing something he feared he might lose. It terrified me because I recognized that look. I'd worn it once myself, the night I watched my mother fade into a hospital bed. The night I realized that love didn't always save you. It just made the losing worse. He told me he had to settle things, to end it once and for all. And though I didn't ask what it was, I already knew. The Moretti Empire was crumbling under the weight of its own blood, and Vincent, with all his fire and fury, was the last pillar holding it upright. He was going to face them, his enemies, his allies, his ghosts, and the knowledge of that truth sat in my chest like a blade I couldn't pull free. "You could leave," he told me one night, his voice quiet, his eyes searching mine as though begging me to say the words he couldn't. "There's money in the bag under the floorboard, enough to disappear. You could still have a life, one that doesn't end in fire." "I already chose," I said, and it was the truth. "If I walk away now, I'll spend every day wondering if you're still breathing." He smiled then, that faint, haunted smile I'd grown to dread. "And if I'm not? Then I'll spend every day hating myself for not being there." He didn't answer. He just pressed his forehead against mine, breathing me in like a man taking his last breath of air before drowning, and whispered, "You shouldn't love me, Lena." "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "But I do." After that, he didn't try to stop me anymore. He just kissed me, slow, desperate, infinite. And when he left the next morning, I didn't ask where he was going because I knew he wouldn't tell me. He simply brushed his fingers against my cheek, whispered, "Stay safe," and walked out into the dawn, leaving the door swinging open behind him, like an unfinished sentence. Hours passed, then a day, then another. And each time the sun dipped below the horizon without him returning, a new part of me began to unravel. I tried to convince myself that he was fine, that he was too careful, too clever to be caught. But hope began to taste like poison the longer I let it sit on my tongue. On the third night, I heard the sirens. It was a faint sound at first, distant and almost unreal. But as they drew closer, my pulse began to match their rhythm. The noise built and built until it filled the room, echoing through the walls, bouncing against the floorboards, and when it finally stopped outside, I knew before I even looked. I ran to the window, heart clawing at my ribs, and through the blur of flashing lights, I saw him. Vincent. But not the Vincent I knew, not the man who held me like I was something worth saving. This was someone else, someone broken open, dragged between two officers, his face bruised, his hands bound behind him. His eyes lifted once, and even from the distance I felt them find mine. There was no fear there, no plea for help, just a quiet, resigned acceptance. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if to say, "Don't come after me." Then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd, the lights, the chaos. The world tilted. My body moved before my mind caught up. I grabbed my coat, my hands trembling so violently I could barely get my arms through the sleeves, and ran out into the street barefoot. The rain had started again, that same relentless rain that had first brought him to me, and the irony cut deep enough to make me laugh, a broken, hollow sound that vanished into the wind. I followed the sirens until they faded, leaving nothing but puddles and echoes behind. By the time I returned to the safe house, soaked and shaking, the place already looked abandoned. His things were gone, the floors wiped clean, the walls stripped bare. It was as if he'd never been there at all, as if the entire thing had been some fever dream conjured by loneliness and danger. But the faint outline of the note he'd once left, the one that had read "Trust no one," was still etched faintly into the table's wood, and I traced the grooves with my fingertips, feeling the weight of its truth settle into my bones. The news came the next morning. I didn't seek it out. It found me the way grief always does, sudden, brutal, indifferent. Crime boss Vincent Moretti apprehended after weeks on the run. Multiple charges pending. They showed his face, blurred by rain and camera flashes, and the words organized crime and murder flashed across the screen like accusations thrown into the wind. I waited for the part where they called him a monster, and when it came, I didn't flinch. Because maybe he was. But he was my monster, and I had loved him all the same. The days that followed were a blur of hiding and noise. Men I didn't recognize came knocking at the door, their questions polite but their eyes sharp, asking if I'd seen him, if I knew anything. I lied to them. I told them I hadn't heard from him in months. I told them I'd never even known his real name, and when they left, I locked the door and pressed my back against it, shaking, wondering if they could hear my heart pounding through the wood. It was a few nights later that I found the letter. It was tucked beneath the floorboard where he'd told me to find the money, sealed in an envelope marked only with my name. My hands shook as I opened it, and as his handwriting unfurled across the page, my breath caught. Lena, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't keep my promise. I wanted to build something better for us, but men like me don't get redemption. They only get delay. Don't try to find me. Don't wait. The best way you can love me now is by living, by walking away before the blood on my hands becomes yours. You once told me that I couldn't protect you from myself. You were right. So this is me trying to protect you the only way I can. By letting you go. V. By the time I finished reading, the ink had blurred beneath my tears. I wanted to scream, to burn the letter, to curse him for leaving me again. But instead I sat there, holding it like something sacred, like a final heartbeat pressed between paper and memory. I thought that would be the end, that his arrest would close the story. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of glass shattering downstairs, followed by the low murmur of voices. I froze, heart hammering, and then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. They'd found me. My mind raced, searching for a plan, an exit, anything. But before I could move, the door to my room burst open, and light flooded in, blinding and harsh. A silhouette stood there, tall, familiar, impossible. And then I heard it, low and ragged, a voice I knew better than my own. Lena, we have to go. Now. My breath caught, disbelief and relief colliding in my chest like thunder. Vincent, I whispered, trembling. He stepped into the light, his face bruised, his eyes wild, his wrists still marked from the cuffs. I told you they wouldn't stop, he said, his voice breaking. But this time I'm not leaving without you. And before I could speak, before I could ask how or why or what came next, the window exploded behind us, the night erupting into chaos once more. The night he came back was the same as the night I met him, thick with rain, restless with thunder, the city holding its breath like it knew something was about to end. The sound of the storm against the windows drowned out everything else. The sirens, the shouting, the footsteps pounding the hallway, and for a moment, it felt like time had looped back to the beginning, to that lonely street where I'd offered a stranger an umbrella without realizing I was inviting the storm itself into my life. Only now the stranger was no longer a mystery, but a man made of scars and ghosts, and I was no longer the woman who believed kindness could save anyone. He looked different in the half-light. Thinner, harder, eyes burning with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from sleeplessness, but from carrying too much grief for too long. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as he crossed the room toward me, water dripping from his hair, blood, fresh and dark, streaking the sleeve of his coat. Behind him, the sound of boots and shouts echoed up the stairwell, closer with each heartbeat, and I knew whatever chase had brought him here had not ended. "Lena," he said, his voice raw, urgent, too human to belong to the legend they'd made him into. "We don't have time. They're coming." He grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward the window, but I resisted, staring at him as if memorizing his face could make sense of everything we'd lost along the way. "You escaped?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head once, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. "Not yet." "Vincent, what did you do?" "What I've always done," he said softly. "I survived." The thunder outside cracked like a whip, the light flaring across his face, and in that brief flash I saw the truth. The inevitability written in the tight line of his jaw, in the small tremor at the corner of his mouth. He hadn't come back to stay. He'd come back to finish something. He led me toward the fire escape, the metal cold and slick beneath our hands as we climbed down into the wet, humming darkness of the alley below. The city seemed to pulse around us, every sound magnified. The rush of rainwater through the gutters, the distant wail of a siren, the steady rhythm of our breaths blending into one another. He kept his gun drawn, his movements careful, but I could feel the weight in him, the knowledge that this was the end of running. We reached the street, and the headlights cut through the mist. 3 black cars pulling up fast, tires hissing against the pavement. Vincent pushed me behind a dumpster, pressing a finger to his lips. "Stay down," he whispered. "No matter what happens?" Before I could answer, the doors opened, and men spilled out. Dark suits, hard faces, guns raised. The night erupted in noise, the sharp crack of gunfire slicing through the rain. Vincent moved like water, like violence personified, each motion precise and deliberate, every shot a statement written in blood. I watched him through the haze, a dark silhouette framed by flashes of lightning, and I thought, absurdly, how beautiful he looked. Terrible and beautiful, the way storms are when you stop running from them. But there were too many of them. He went down once, staggered, caught himself, fired again. My breath hitched, my fingers gripping the wet metal edge of the dumpster until my knuckles ached. I wanted to scream his name, to run to him, but fear pinned me where I was. Then I saw one of the men flank him from behind, gun raised, and something inside me broke. I didn't think. I just moved. The world narrowed to the rhythm of my heartbeat, the slickness of the pavement beneath my feet, the way his eyes widened when he saw me running toward him. The gun went off before I reached him, the sound deafening. For a second, I didn't know who had been hit. Then I felt it, the sudden, searing pain spreading through my side, the warmth of blood against the cold rain. I stumbled, and he caught me before I fell, his arm wrapping around me, pulling me to his chest. "No, no, no," he said, his voice breaking apart as he pressed his hand against the wound, his fingers slick with crimson. "Lena, stay with me." I tried to smile, but it felt weak, unreal. "You always said I should have walked away," I whispered. "Guess I never learned." He laughed, a broken, disbelieving sound, and pulled me closer, his breath warm against my ear. "You shouldn't have been here," he said. "You came back for me," I murmured. "Where else would I be?" The world blurred then, the edges softening. The sound of sirens grew louder, closer, until they drowned out the rain. but it all felt far away now, as though the city itself had started to fade. I could feel him trembling, could hear the crack in his voice as he whispered my name over and over like a prayer he didn't believe in anymore. And then I felt him move. He shifted me gently against the wall, his hand still on mine, and I saw it in his eyes, the decision forming before he even spoke it. "I can't let them take you," he said, and I knew what he meant before he reached for his gun. "No," I whispered, gripping his hand, the pain forgotten, replaced by something deeper, heavier. "Don't do this." He leaned in, pressing his forehead against mine, his breath shaking. "You gave me shelter," he said softly. "Now I'll give you peace." Before I could answer, he rose, stepping out into the street, his silhouette framed by the flashing lights. He fired once, twice, and then the world exploded again. Gunfire, shouting, the echo of his name carried by the storm. When the noise finally stopped, the rain was all that remained, falling steady and unrelenting. I don't remember how long I sat there. Long enough for the sirens to fade. Long enough for the cold to sink into my bones. When I finally crawled to where he lay, the street was washed clean except for him. Vincent, still and quiet. The rain tracing down his face like tears the sky was shedding for us both. I pressed my fingers against his chest, searching for something, anything. And when I found it, the faintest flutter of a heartbeat, I let out a sound I didn't recognize, half sob, half prayer. He wasn't gone. Not yet. I pulled the umbrella from where it had fallen beside him. My umbrella, the same one from that night so long ago, still carrying the faint scent of the rain that had first bound us, and held it over him, shielding him from the storm as best I could. My hands were shaking, my vision blurring, but I stayed there, whispering his name, whispering every word I'd never said, until the city lights dimmed and dawn began to bleed through the clouds. The police came eventually. They shouted, pulled me away, wrapped blankets around my shoulders. Someone asked my name, and for a moment I almost told them the new one, the name he'd given me, the one meant for a life without him. But when I opened my mouth, what came out instead was the truth. "My name is Lena Hart," I said, "and he's not the monster you think he is." They didn't listen, of course. They never do. But as they led me away, I looked back one last time, at the street where it had all begun and ended, at the man who had walked through fire and rain and ruin just to find his way back to me. The sun was breaking through the clouds now, soft and golden, turning the wet pavement into glass. And as the light touched his face, I swore I saw him smile, faint and fleeting, like he'd finally made peace with the world. Or maybe just with me. It's been months since that night, and sometimes, when the sky darkens and the first drops begin to fall, I still find myself looking for him in the rain. I know it's madness. I know he's gone. But the heart doesn't measure truth in years or reason. It measures in moments, in memories, in the way a single sound can reopen everything you thought you'd buried. They say storms wash the world clean, but I've learned that some things the rain never forgets. It remembers the promises whispered between thunder and silence. It remembers the touch of hands stained by love and violence. And sometimes, when it falls soft against my window, I imagine it's him, coming back one last time to remind me that even in ruin, even in darkness, even in the terrible beauty of everything we destroyed together, love was never a mistake. It was simply the price of shelter,